Welcome, everybody. This session is entitled, it's part of the Political Ecology of Basic Income in Canada series. This session is called a communication workshop for advocates to get the word out. So my name is Sheila Regehr. Most of you know me. I'm the chair of the Basic Income Canada Network. I'm just doing housekeeping. This is Tim's show. So first announcements, this session is brought to you by basic income organizations in the United States and Canada with the generous support of sponsors, the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity, Humanity Forward Foundation, Aid Kit, and Steady. So as we begin, just a little bit of info about Crowdcast. So you'll all see down on your screen, there's an Ask a Question button. If you do want to ask a question, put it in the question button. Otherwise, feel free to use the chat. The chat has been quite lively. People have shared all kinds of thoughts and ideas and comments as things go on. And apparently that gets saved too. So it's a really important part of our conversation. So that's all for me. I am simply going to introduce Tim now really briefly. I mean, there's so much in his background. He says he has an eclectic bio. I know him in several of his lives, but I think one of the most important, and even in the last session we had, we were talking about political spectrum. Somebody in the chat was talking about like what's going on with all of this right-wing extremist attack on basic income stuff lately. So people are thinking about these issues. So Tim's key role now is as an organizer with Lead Now, and they're focused on empowering people to engage with our democracy using cutting-edge technology blended with tried and tested organizing tactics. And Tim has lots of experience with this, Canadian and American. So over to you, Tim, and I am going to turn myself off.
Well, thanks, Sheila. I really appreciate that. I'm told my speakers are a little soft, so I'm going to try and speak up. If you have trouble hearing me, just throw it in the chat and I will speak a little louder. Before we do begin, I just want to acknowledge we're calling in from all over North America, which is traditional territory for many Indigenous peoples and nations. I'm in Toronto, and this is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is currently home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. The land you call home is likely also the traditional territory of Indigenous people. If you know the history of your land, this is a great time to pause and reflect on that heritage. If you don't, there's a great website, native-land.ca. It's a great resource for learning more about the people who made their homes on the land you currently share, both before the invasion by European settlers and to this day. And also, as we acknowledge this historical legacy, necessarily also have to acknowledge that the colonial invasion does continue to this day. There's still armed soldiers evicting Indigenous people from their lands in the name of commerce. There's still sniper squads targeting Indigenous families so their wealth can be extracted. That's happening now. So when we acknowledge the land and we acknowledge the historical injustice, we have to acknowledge our own benefit and complicity in what is going on to this day and our responsibility to set that to right. Not a comfortable thing to recognize that we individually do benefit from that exploitation, but it is true, even though we're not actively supporting it. So when we acknowledge that truth, there is a moral imperative to play an active role in restoring justice. So with that in mind, I am grateful to welcome you all here today to discuss how we win the struggle for basic income, which is part and parcel of the struggle for justice. Every political battle is fought first on the information landscape. By the time you're voting, a lot of it's already been decided by the narratives that have been constructed. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. My agenda today, a little bit about the current context, the communications landscape, including opposition communications, and now this big challenge of mis and disinformation. Then we'll talk about some proactive messaging steps we can take to set ourselves up for comm success, and then a few reactive countermeasures we can take to fight back against this messaging that is coming out about our policies. And then finally, I'll leave you with some direct next steps you can take and make some room for questions. So diving right in, we are basic income advocates for a lot of different reasons, but we have probably in our advocacy come across some opposing points. People who oppose our vision. You may have heard some from the left. Maybe they'll say, oh, they're using this as a cover for cuts. Sometimes from the right, you may hear, oh, but like, won't people just stay home and be lazy? But a lot of times the biggest comms challenge for us is just awareness. A lot of people are simply not well acquainted, if acquainted at all, with basic income. Because of something called anchoring bias, the first framing that people hear around a new concept is usually the one they'll compare later framings to. So there is value in getting there first and having a widespread reach for our message, especially if we have a well-constructed message, which we'll talk a bit more about. Also, now we're all struggling with misinformation and disinformation. You may have heard some of the basic income is a government plot to take control, to make us slaves to the government. This sort of thing is percolating up. So misinformation is just false information. This is not a new thing. And then there's disinformation, which is intentionally false information. That's an important distinction. Where does it come from? You know, there's a lot of sources. There are intentional bad actors out there. If you look at the anti-vax information, a lot of that came from weaponized disinformation agents. That's both from foreign powers who are trying to undermine public health responses to weaken some of our nations. Also from some extremist disinformation hubs. These are groups that are using the anti-vax stuff as a lever to cause people to question the system that we live within, to disenchant them with that system, which makes them open to radicalization, which is the goal of these more extremist groups. Those groups may know the information is fake. They may not. They may not care. But they use it because they want to get people disenchanted with the institutions and the system we have so they can give them an alternative. And, you know, let's face it, system could be better. So there's room for improvement, no doubt about that. But what they're trying to do is leverage people out of it entirely so that they can give them a completely different alternative. And then sometimes you get it bubbling up from the grassroots, and I'll talk more about how that happens and why in a minute. The reason the misinformation and the disinformation is effective, there's a few. One, it tends to activate frames and plug people into compelling stories that give them something they need narratively. Stories they already have in their minds or they're seeking in their minds. Things like trying to gain control over the world. It's a confusing, complicated world. It's not a good thought to know that there's a lot of chaos out there. Having a clear, consistent explanation, whether it's true or not, helps people feel back in control. That's a need they have, a lot of them. It also can be effective because it comes from people they trust. Family, friends, new comrades from these movements they're joining. And there's an entire information ecosystem across which this disinformation cross-pollinates, mutates, and bubbles up new versions. And that's part of how we got this basic income stuff. The way that it spreads plays into that. We all blame social media. That's the hot thing to do. And that's for good reason. But let's not pretend that's the only source. Americans, you've got Fox News. Canadians, I'm sure you've read a terrible Rex Murphy column. There's plenty of corporate media that is giving you fake information or spun information as well. But the social media is a key vector. And that is for a few reasons. It's fast. It's largely unmoderated. It is built on existing relationships. And Facebook in particular is built to connect people who already know each other. And what that means is that when people are sharing information through these networks, they're sharing it to people they know who presumably trust them to some extent. It's familiar source. That's a lot more powerful than a broadcast message because it's coming from someone they trust. And social media really amplifies that. It also connects new people into those networks quite quickly. And because they are advertising driven, the incentive for the social media companies is to get as many views as possible. And the way they do that is with these algorithms that promote content that is highly engaging because people will engage with it, come back to it, share it, see it. That crucially doesn't mean stuff that they like or stuff that is true, just stuff that gets them engaging, meaning commenting, replying, reposting, liking or disliking, arguing. That's all engagement. It all reads the same to the algorithm. And that means that stuff that is outrageous, stuff that is really compelling and exciting gets amplified more. And that also means as we think about our countermeasures, and we'll talk about that a bit later, we have to really think about what we're doing. because sometimes like replying or debunking things directly because of the algorithm is actually only amplifying the original bad message. It goes a lot further than any comment does. So there's time and a place to do the debunking, but you got to be careful and measured with it. Another reason why it's been spreading is because there are communities built around this kinds of disinformation. It cross-pollinates there. Once people get disaffected from the mainstream system, they fall into these more radical ecosystems. They find explanations they like and they value, and instantly there's a network of other people there supporting them in that decision. It's like converting to a new religion in many ways. And what happens then is that these different people bring their own independent beliefs into that ecosystem, and they all start to cross-pollinate, and it starts to bubble up. And what you see is, for example, the World Economic Forum has become this sort of boogeyman of wealthy elites trying to control the world. And there's a germ of truth to that. The Economic Forum is mostly wealthy groups who are trying to get some stability in the world. There's a germ of truth there, but out of that comes a very easy villain narrative around which other things can be constructed. And from there, you get this festering underdark of conspiracy, and it's easy for people to tack on new ones that sound believable. And a lot of where this basic income is a government plot comes from, that's an easy thing to tack on. Like, oh, we've already got this shadowy cabal of elites. Of course they want you dependent, right? And so basic income is getting tacked into that. People will do that because they want to have something to contribute. So they may come up with an idea, or they may make a connection and think, wow, I've uncovered something cool. They also, to forge their identity as someone who has like a little bit more of the secret truth, right? Or sometimes it's intentional. They may feel like, oh, a basic income would actually undercut our efforts to radicalize because people would be more secure. We've got to stop it. And so they may do it as a way to proactively undercut our message. So what do we do about all that? It's if I had a guaranteed answer, it would be a very different world. But I do have some countermeasures that can work and some techniques that are valuable. First off, proactively, we should be thinking as a movement, and any organization you're part of should be thinking about our framing and our story, our narrative, and making sure that it's compelling. If facts were enough, we could all go home. Facts are not enough. The stories are what people remember. Facts will tell you what's true, but stories are how people know what's important and how they make sense of the world. So you need a compelling narrative that holds together, that's quick to grasp, that people can see themselves reflected in. It's worth taking the time to think through a comms plan. Think about, who are you trying to reach? Where are you trying to reach them? What do you want them to know? What does success look like? Like, oh, we've got this message out. What is success? 500 people agree with this position. What does the success look like? And what do you want them to do next? Because like all comms plays into organizing, and organizing is how you get the success in the long run. And organizing is just dialogues at scale. So you're starting a conversation with any comms outreach. Know what's next. Know how you can get feedback from that campaign, and make sure you know what success looks like and what your narrative is. We need people to know what basic income is. Sure, it's guaranteed income security. Sure, it's monthly payments or whatever. But what else is it? Think about your values. It's freedom. It's peace of mind. It's the same kind of security that rich people take for granted. But for everyone, it's universal, and you can always count on it. So you do want to make sure that those kinds of value-driven statements are a lot more accessible. They're common denominators that you can lead with, and then add a little bit of detail. Tactically, when you're talking about a particular message, think about the frames you're activating with our messaging. When I say frames, I mean the way in which people are understanding and receiving that message. When you talk about, security, people may be thinking about their own economic security. They may be thinking about scarcity. They may be thinking about abundance. The framing is what you're activating there. You want people to feel, like they're part of the story, like it's a positive vision, like you can resolve some of the negative emotions that are being drawn out by the opposing sides. You do want to make it accessible. And when I say accessible, I mean, first off, yes, like have it in a variety of media, have it in a variety of, make sure you're having accessibility, things like alt text with your images so that people who are using screen readers can access it. That sort of accessibility, but also Accessibility to the general public means making sure you're speaking to them where they are, in language they understand already, and in a way that's engaging to them. Doug Ford is now the Ontario Premier again, was reelected recently with a campaign. I'm not a huge Doug Ford fan, but I will say he ran a good campaign message-wise. The slogan was "Get it done." It's very simple. He really didn't bother with the specifics, and he didn't have to. What does "get it done" mean specifically? Who knows? And who cares? It worked, right? It's a vague positive. It's easy. It's simple. It overwhelmed all the narratives. And every communications piece that Doug Ford's team put out used that theme, but also could be understood at a 6th grade reading level. And that means that just about everybody can read and understand that message. There's a lot of academics involved in our movement, and I think that's great. It gives us a lot of great resources and smarts to draw from. And also, we need to be sure that we've got the 6th grade reading level communications out there as well. You do want to make it appealing and exciting, and know that the algorithms on social media reward graphics and video. They bump them up higher than text. So if you can get graphics and videos content, that helps you get further reach as well. And they're more engaging. We'll talk more about some nuts and bolts of that in a minute. But yeah, lead with the values. The values, they're widespread, and the common denominators that you got. A lot of times, I'm very active in the climate movement, and a lot of times we struggle where we are like, wow, there's this huge problem. Here's some solutions, and that's okay. But the better thing to do is to lead with the values first, because then people are drawn in and ready to hear the rest of your message. If you start with the problem, people go either, wow, that's a lot to deal with. I don't want to deal with that. That's too much. Or they're like, well, I've got enough problems. I don't actually need this right now in my life. So you're really only reaching people who are already receptive to your position. By leading with your values, you've got a much lower common denominator, which means much more people can be brought in and then can see like, oh, I share these values, so this problem does affect me, and I do care. And then you can go into the solutions. Repetition matters too. You want to make it stick. You've seen probably a bazillion Coke and Pepsi ads in your day by now. They're not doing that because they want you to buy Coke and Pepsi in that moment so much. They're doing it for the familiarity. You know what Coke and Pepsi are. You know it. You're never going to forget it. It's very familiar. So when you do get to that decision point where you're thinking about pop or soda or whatever you call it, then you know about Coke and Pepsi, and they're familiar to you. And there is bias there where we tend towards more familiar things when we make our decisions. So it's the familiarity. So consistency, get your narrative, get your messaging, stick with it. As far as engaging on social media, I want to teach you a trick. We did a cool campaign during the recent election around amplification. So there's paid ads, but there's also organic messaging. Let me do the paid stuff first. So you can get a lot of bang with your buck on paid advertising. And I'm talking like $50, $100, does not need to be huge budget. You can do quite a bit of reach with just a small budget. And there's a number of platforms. Facebook is great, but also Reddit has a lot of highly engaged people. Spotify, the audio site, great for reaching people who love music and art, a lot of younger people. Google ads. When we think of Google ads, you probably think of like when you're searching and you see at the top of your search result, those ads. Yep, that's good if you want to get to certain things. And it may be good, like one good placement there. If we look for disinformation sites that are promoting anti-basic income messages, we could pay for search ads so that a good explainer about basic income appears above those search results. So that's one option there, right? But also, Google ads have another vendor that feeds into just about every platform. So you can get ads through Google into Android phones, into YouTube, onto a bunch of websites. So they're all over the map. And it's great reach and really excellent targeting. You can target people by a lot of different demographic information, geography, geofencing in areas. So by their search results, there's a lot of ways you can reach them and target exactly the audience you're looking for. With the amplification side organically. So we ran a campaign recently called Not One Seat, and a big part of our campaign effort was around amplification because we didn't exist 6 weeks before the election. So we needed a lot of visibility very quickly. The way that we did that was we did a grassroots amplification team on Twitter primarily, although we did also use Instagram and Facebook. But we chose Twitter because there's not a high utility rate among the population at large, but it is dominant among journalists, politicians, political organizations, unions, corporations, all of the thought leaders of society, essentially. And so by getting high visibility there, we were able to get a lot of visibility into the legacy media. The way that it worked, we had our platform, our Twitter page, and we got grassroots people who engaged with our content were directly messaged and asked to join an amplification team. That team, once they fill out a little form, which gave us their information, so we knew who they were. We could sort them by the size of their account, the kinds of topics they wanted to engage with, they were most interested in, their location. And then when we put out content, we would add them to different direct message groups on Twitter. You can have up to 50 people in a direct message group. We'd add them to direct message groups based on those other criteria, their platform size, their interests, policy interests, and so forth. And then we'd create content for those groups. And when it was launched on our page, we'd immediately message it to them, tell them this is up, engage with it, and retweet it, and get that visibility. And what that does is the first few minutes of a post are the most critical for the algorithm. So by getting immediate organic engagement, unpaid, we were showing the algorithm that we had a lot of engagement value behind our content. And so we were able to get up to thousands of followers. The first day, we had over 100,000 impressions on our first video tweet. And by the end of the election, just 6 weeks, we had 3.5 million impressions, all organically, just from that amplification effort. And on top of that, we got tons of narrative coverage in the legacy media because they saw it. They saw us on Twitter, and they came to us for interviews. We got interview requests literally within the first few hours. So that organic amplification, by building a similar engine, you can get a lot more reach on those platforms, and that gets you out to more people who you can proactively engage. And people like to contribute. So if you're giving them a way to proactively contribute that is easy, takes a couple minutes a day, that's something people are going to respond to, especially people who are particularly keen advocates. And that's a good way to put them to work and keep them involved in your efforts. A few nuts and bolts for folks who want to know the nuts and bolts. You should have a page on Facebook and a group for your supporters to connect with or laterally speak to each other. If you don't want to have a group, that's okay, but you should have some place for your supporters to talk to each other. That's what's happening with the disinformation. They're talking to each other and spreading their information among each other. When we do the same, we build our own ecosystems, and we should be cross-pollinating across different groups, having them in shared spaces so each of us can share different messaging campaigns with each other. Twitter, like I said, is good for journalists, good for politicians. Instagram is good for younger people, but also influencers. There's a lot of like health and wellness influencers, those sorts of things. They are reachable to get messages to their followers. Sometimes they ask you to pay. They put a little tab that says this is a promo piece. Sometimes they'll do it for free. But it's a good way to reach a lot of people quickly, which is good for visibility. YouTube is a good place to put your video content on. There's an algorithm for recommending new content. So it's good to have stuff up there so that it gets recommended to others. There are some platforms you may not want to be on or may not be able to maintain very easily. My advice is if you can't keep a page on a social media platform up to date at least a couple times a month, it's better to have no page than an abandoned looking page. Because what happens with an abandoned page is people will find it and say, oh, nothing's happening, so this group is dead, is gone, or is not very effective. So if you can't afford to, if you can't get a volunteer or anyone to run a page for you on a particular platform, better to just have nothing, or just like a pinned post that says like, we don't use this, go to our website, whatever. Like I said, graphics and video go a lot further. There's a good app called Canva. It is free, although there's higher pay levels to do more advanced stuff. For graphic design, it's built for quick, punchy graphics for social media. And Biteable is a similar sort of concept, but for video. Lots of stock footage, very, very easy to use to turn out videos that are compelling quickly. Our Earth Day video we did in 2 hours. I'm by no means a video expert. We did it very, very quickly because there's just a lot of great material there and it's so simple to use. That too is like, I think it's free at the basic level, and then it's like 20 or 30 bucks a month for the more advanced level. So those are great apps to use to get that content created. So that's more the proactive side. I'll talk a little bit about the reactive side, like reacting to the other information, and then we'll get into some questions. So we all think about like, debate or debunking. There's room for that. Definitely. You don't want to leave these messages unopposed, but you got to think about how you do it and who you're talking to. If you are on social media and you're talking to someone about politics, it's public. And when it's public, like that's not a good place to convince someone of something. Your audience in a social media debate is not the other person. It's everyone watching you talk to that person. So that's who you're really talking to. Think about the frames that you're activating when you communicate there. When we engage with, like, say, the deficit, people will complain like, oh, the deficit. A lot of times we'll engage with like some numbers and like, actually, it'll be good for the deficit for this and that and why reason. That is great if someone's engaging in good faith, but if they're just in combat with you to undercut your narrative, when you engage on their frame about the expense, now what people are going to leave remembering is like, oh yeah, we talked all about the expense. They're probably not going to remember most of the details. So when you engage on their frame, you're handing them a bit of a victory right out the gate. The odds are stacked against you. So we want to be thinking about creating our own narrative and wherever possible, pivoting to our narrative in our responses. We know the facts are on our side, but like I said, the facts don't stick in the brain the same way. They're good to support your case, know them, sure, but the most important thing is that compelling narrative. So try and turn and pivot to our talking. So like, let's say we've heard this before from the right-wingers, oh, if you have basic income, people are just going to stay home and be lazy. They're not going to work. We know the facts. We know that's actually not true. But again, engaging with that narrative often just reinforces it. The pivot is they're actually conceding a lot by making that claim. So they're going to hit you with that and say, hey, okay, so what you're saying is if we pass a basic income, your worst case is people might be lazy. Let's compare that to the current worst case of starvation and homelessness, families breaking apart, eviction. If the worst case you've got is some people might stay home with their families, you're conceding that this is a wildly successful poverty elimination program. I'm glad we agree that basic income is going to eliminate homelessness. It's going to eliminate starvation. It's going to empower people to start their own businesses. And that the worst thing that might happen is people might see their kids more. Sounds very successful. Thanks for agreeing that it's going to be so effective. So you're pivoting there to your frame out of their attack rather than trying to just debunk it. With the misinformation and disinformation, it's tricky because it's such a cohesive thing. They plug into this big worldview, this ecosystem. A lot of the misinformation and disinformation countermeasures really do come down to the same kinds of tactics that deprogram people from cults because it's a very similar mode of operation. I really encourage, if you've got people who are espousing the disinformation, like for us as a movement, it's the biggest countermeasure is to be proactive, get very visible with our narrative so that ours takes place and takes seed first in more and more people so that people are sort of immunized to it. But when you aren't countering it, the most effective way to engage with that sort of stuff is one-on-one, not in a public setting with people they trust, with relational discussions. There's a whole webinar that I could do on just that, but what you're doing there is you've got to meet them where they are. You've got to engage them in sort of the Socratic method of asking them questions. When you challenge people and turn it into a debate or an argument, they leave, the studies on this are very clear, they leave that argument more convinced than less convinced. So that's almost always the case. Even if you win, people just get defensive. What you need to do is ask questions, lead them to a place where they start to understand the inconsistencies, start to understand the disconnect, start to understand your position, and build as much of a connection and relationship with them as you can, because the stronger that bond of trust is, you're offering a bridge out for them, and you're offering them an opportunity to incorporate more of your worldview in their decision, because when you have a strong bond of trust, they do want to incorporate that. And that's what's happening with the disinformation. They're building strong bonds of trust with people who have fallen into the same rabbit hole, either intentionally or just through whim. So have that conversation one-on-one without the pressure of needing to look like they're winning, or with space to back down and admit they're a little wrong. give them a bit of the facts, but do it in a way that they can incorporate through their own questioning. As much as possible, you want to ask them questions and be genuine. Like, hey, I don't understand the connection here. Can you explain how these two things are connected? And often they're not. And so it's hard to explain. And when you do that enough, then eventually people do start to say, well, I actually don't understand exactly how they connect. And that is when they start questioning it for themselves, that's the opening for them to pull out of that rabbit hole, pull out of that ecosystem. And so that's the way that I recommend for that, for the disinformation, because it's just so difficult to do. And when it's public, people's emotions quickly get riled up and they really feel like they're in the fight of their lives. Like it's really good or evil. If they were right, it would be really important for them to win, is the thing to remember, right? So if you were in their position, you'd really, really want to convince other people, and you'd really, really want to win that battle because they feel like it's this epic good versus evil. When you fight them on it like that, you become part of the evil, and they're not going to change their mind for that. What you need to do is come at it from the side, ask genuine questions, and they're going to love to share information. So they're going to be open to that, and then get them to find for themselves the disconnect. I have a good webinar that we did on this during the convoy in Canada, and I'm happy to share the link with that. I think, Sheila, maybe you can share that around afterwards. I don't have it handy. Cool. I'm going to talk a little bit about next steps in action for each of you, and then we'll go to some questions. You can use the ask question. I see a couple in there, or just throw it in the chat. So some actions to take home from this. So there's some great information from a guy named George Lakoff on framing and the value of framing. Does really good work in understanding how frames work in your brain, in other people's brains, how you can engage them. It's a great book called Don't Think of an Elephant, because when you say don't think of an elephant, people think of an elephant. It's inevitable. So good book for there. You can start doing some reading there. Think about your social media presence and how you are using it, if you're using it. And if you're a part of an organization, think about the way that your organization is doing it. Do they have a comms plan? Do they have any kind of organic like amplification or any kind of organizing around their messaging? Do they have a budget for paid ads, and how are they using it? You're going to get way more bang for your buck on digital than you are on radio ads or billboards most of the time. So think about those things, review those with your organizations. But number one, like, what's your narrative? And that doesn't just mean for the movement as a whole. We should have that, sure. But also you, as an individual, why are you a basic income supporter? Have your elevator pitch. Have that 30-second, like, this is why. Start with your values. Share your story, your personal narrative. Understand that too, because that story is really going to be persuasive when you're in the one-on-one. And that story is really going to matter and inform the rest of your communications. Like basic income for me, like I was homeless for a while. This would have made a tremendous difference. It would have made such a difference for me in my life when I was that poor, and especially back in the States where I didn't have healthcare, any of that stuff. Like I went through some stuff. Basic income would have been the kind of security that I saw my wealthy friends had because their family had money and mine didn't. It would have made such a difference. And it's important to me to make that difference for people now, because I've been there and I know what it's like. So like, know that story, know that narrative. You care for a reason. You're passionate for a reason. That passion is going to come through. That authenticity is going to come through. Forgot to mention the authenticity, by the way. Don't be telling fibs for sure, but also just like speak your truth, your authenticity, because people do respond to that. It resonates. We live in this hyper-capitalist society where everyone is selling stuff all the time and it's very transactional. People are very wise to being sold things to. And they don't like it. We don't like it. Authenticity resonates. This is Bernie's secret. Bernie's a great messenger because he's consistent, he's very clear, but he's really authentic. He's been saying the same thing for 50 years because it's who he is. That stuff resonates. So your next steps, think about your narrative, write it down, practice it. Get back to your orgs that you volunteer with or that you are part of, get a comms plan, think about your social media presence. How can you get people amplifying it? How can you engage your supporters with it? And how can you cross-pollinate and build our own information ecosystem to counter what's being built on the extreme elements? So those are your next, that's your homework. I'm going to open it up for questions. Let's take a look. Here we go. Ask question. Great. Do I have a communications blueprint or resource list or Rolodex of tools you use or recommend? I do have things along those lines. I have like a Twitter for advocacy guide toolkit, and then I have all the materials we used for the Not One Seat campaign, which I'm happy to share all of it. You can actually get all the Not One Seat stuff on our website, notoneseat.ca, because we did it very open source. So a lot of the resources are on there, including the toolkit that explains the amplification program. But I'm also happy to send more around. Sheila, I don't know how to reach people after this, but if we can talk, I'll give you like a bunch of stuff to send around. I hope that's okay. So yes, I'll make sure you get all the stuff that I have. Can you tell if someone posting to your page or group is a bot or agent versus legitimate? And in general, do you recommend engaging or ignoring, etc.? That's a great question. It can be tough. If they are posting to your page, it's great to engage them because they're amplifying your content. So engage them for sure. If they're being abusive, just you know, don't tolerate that. Of course, you want to make it not hostile. But if they're engaging, even if it's pretty clearly in bad faith, great. They're ramping up your thing. You can probably win the argument. That's the ideal time to have your argument. Get your talking points out. Just engage it as long as they want. It's just boosting your earlier content. So that's great. And that's why we don't want to do that to their content so much, because it's going to boost their stuff. If it is like a bot or an agent that's there specifically to undermine and they're constant, monitor the effect it's having on the community. If it is something that's like, you know, it happened once and it's just under a post and there's lots of engagement, it's boosting, great. If it's constant and they're trying to just undermine like your morale, you may want to ban them. Like measure the impact on your community by looking at how people are responding. Just ask people too how they feel about it. You should have your own space for lateral communication. So ask people how they feel about those sorts of things. Get consensus from your group. You can report stuff. I'd be cautious about reporting stuff on your own page because it seems to dock your page a bit too. But report their stuff. 9 Ways to Sunday. That's a great response to disinformation. The algorithms are not very, or the platforms are not very good about giving you a way to just report like this is false, because they don't really want to deal with it because it gets a lot of engagement and that's where they get their money. But you can just do reporting as spam or something similar, or things like that for their content, for sure, to do that. You can also, on Facebook, there's a setting where you can essentially mute their posts so that it's invisible to the rest of your community, but they don't know it's been blocked. So they can still just keep ranting as long as they want. And you can respond if you want, but like no one else is seeing it now, which is kind of nice. That's on Facebook. You can do that. Cool. Any other questions? Great. I don't see any there. What I will do is, Sheila, I'll put some content together for you. And then also I'm going to put my email in the chat. So if you ever have questions or would like some advice or just want to chat and connect, feel free to give me a shout. I do a lot of this work. Oh, no. Yeah, get my headphones out. Sorry. I do a lot of this work, and I also do a lot of just general tech work, like databases stuff. And I think like the organizing and data side is really underlooked in our movement. There's a lot of value to data because, again, a campaign is dialogue at scale. So you need to have data to scale up your dialogue. Love to chat about that stuff too. So feel free to give me a shout. I'm going to put it in the chat. Oops. Director. Great. And I think that's it. If there's no more questions, then I will turn it back over to Sheila.
Sorry, Hannah and I crossed signals right at the last minute. Cool. Perfect, and perfect timing too. Thank you so much, Tim. This is just like phenomenal, and I'm sure that lots of people are going to want to follow up. I've been looking at the chat, and like it's just so important. Anyway, thank you everyone for attending the session. Just to note that a recording will be available. I think Hannah said that we might be able to post the link to that convoy thing that you were talking about to the chat afterwards. We'll see, but the recording of this is available as soon as the session is over. That's how Crowdcast works. And then I want to invite everybody to the next session to join with our American colleagues for the plenary called Politics of Basic Income, the Strategy of Winning National Policy, where policy strategists will discuss how we move forward. Oh, sorry, I heard a voice. And then this year's conference closes with Rethinking Basic Income, Challenges to Universality and Uniformity in Payment. and Canadian icon Evelyn Forget will be part of that. And then at the end of the conference and the closing remarks, everybody is invited to gather in Kumo space to continue conversations. And because we are getting close to the end, I just a reminder to everybody that entering Kumo space requires you to turn your camera off if you're in Crowdcast or Zoom, and then go into Kumo space and turn it back on again. But more to come. Hopefully you'll keep participating in other sessions. Thank you very much again.